Good morning, everybody. Happy Friday. Let me see if I can do this in such a way that I can read and you guys can actually see the slides. They took my lamp away, so I have to make do today. All right. Last time we kind of picked up with the end of the Late Bronze Age. We've been talking about this Late Bronze Age collapse. Again, that international system that lasted from around 1600 to 1200 BCE. With all the empires, all the states that we looked at, we started looking at this process of collapse and the emergence of new people, the sea peoples. And we talked about the Philistines, their material culture. Any questions about any of that material before we get started? Any questions about anything we've covered so far that's been lingering in your mind? Now's your chance. Before we start this new section. Okay. I wanted to also let you guys know the review sheet. I was about to post it and I was going through it. There's material on the review sheet that I want to add and update, so I'm going to get that up a little bit later in the semester. I don't want you guys to take a look at it and, there's material that I'd like to update and make a little more applicable. We've covered different things this semester than we have in semesters past, so I want to make sure it's representative of what is going to be on the final. So that will be coming up. But in the meantime, we've been talking about this Late Bronze Age collapse, and particularly the collapse of these major powers, the city of Ugarit, the capital of the Hittites at Hattusas, these destructions that take place around 1200, and a dark age that sets in from around 1200 to 1000 BCE. While these coastal powers, like Ugarit, like the Hittite Empire up in the Anatolian Peninsula, Egypt even, come under attack by these sea peoples, Assyria, of all of these powers, really weathers the storm. We do have records from Syria at the site of Emar that talk about hordes of people, hordes of unidentified people attacking the city. So we do know that there's a tremendous amount of unrest in Assyria during this time. However, really from the Late Bronze Age into now the Iron Age, there's a tremendous amount of continuity. However, unfortunately not many texts that talk about what's taking place during this time. So there's no real break between the Middle Assyrian period, right? The Middle Assyrian period, which was the time of Tukulti-Ninurta that we talked about, and what's known as the Neo-Assyrian period, right? The New Assyrian period, which begins around the 9th century, and particularly begins with the reign of a king named Ashurnasirpal II. And Ashurnasirpal II takes the throne around 883 BCE, and he's typically used by scholars to sort of demarcate this new phase in Assyrian history. In 3 short centuries following Ashurnasirpal, Assyria really begins to expand tremendously, incorporating, and you can see in this map here, not just all of the south, but extending again from sea to sea, from the Mediterranean all the way to the Persian Gulf, at times even encompassing Egypt. So a very, very large period of expansion as Assyria fills in the power vacuum that's left in the wake of the Late Bronze Age. Under Ashurnasirpal, we see this expansion take place, and for the most part, we get the impression that it was a fairly violent process. The Assyrians, especially the later Assyrians after Ashurnasirpal, depict themselves as a fairly warlike people, fairly aggressive in conquest. So actually we read from the annals of Ashurnasirpal II, when some of these city-states would revolt against the Assyrian expansion, they were dealt with very harshly. So he writes of a particular city, "Their men, young and old, I took as prisoners. Some of them I cut off their feet and hands. Others I cut off their noses and lips. Of young men's ears I made a large heap, and of old men's heads I made a tremendous pile. I exposed their heads as trophies in front of the city. The male and female children I cast into the flames, and the city I destroyed and consumed with fire. So pretty strong talk. And again, we're going to see that there's evidence that this was backed up in fact as well. But clearly, the emergence of a new ideology, this ideology of expansion with Assyria as a strong center, with an almost sort of right to take over these lands that surround it. Neo-Assyrian sites such as Nimrud, Khorsabad, Nineveh, cities we're going to be looking at in depth, were excavated by Layard and Botha in the 1840s. And a lot of this material was brought back to the major imperial capitals of the time, right? At that time, this region was controlled by France, it was controlled by Britain, so a lot of these monuments were brought back to museums like the Louvre, like the British Museum in London. And really this introduced ancient Mesopotamia to a European audience. At this point, Mesopotamia, like Egypt, becomes very much a part of European fascination and goes hand in hand with colonialism and imperialism, as we talked about earlier in the semester. In terms of Ashurnasirpal II, Ashurnasirpal, by the way, it actually means Ashur is the guardian of the sun. As the leader of this new expanding territory, and really a leader who's modeling himself quite differently, well, what are you going to do, for one thing? If you are now moving away from the old, you're establishing a new empire, what's the first thing you're going to do? We've seen this with Tukulti Ninurta in the past. We've seen this with Kurigalzu. We saw this with Amenhotep IV. Sorry? Move the capital, exactly, yeah. So that's the first thing that he does upon returning from campaign. He actually moves out of Ashur. Now remember, Ashur is the city that we've seen since the old Assyrian period. It's a city that has a tremendous legacy, right? A priesthood that's entrenched there. So of course, right, what you're going to do is move the capital. And he does this, he moves it to a site known as Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, which was a city that was, as you can see here, on the Tigris, between a branch of the Tigris and a tributary, the Greater Zab. And really, Nimrud was settled before, but as we'll see, it's a purpose-built capital during the reign of Ashurnasirpal II. He revamps the entire site, creating a city that's almost 8 miles long, 360 hectares in circumference, and built of over 70 million bricks. So at the center of this capital, on the main mound, Ashurnasirpal II builds, of course, a palace. And this palace is primarily a propagandistic expression of the king's power and legitimacy. And we see a number of new artistic conventions during this period, primarily in the form of architectural sculpture. Now remember, the Assyrians had to sort of invent themselves during the Late Bronze Age, right? They get into this game of the great powers, starting to write to Egypt, write to Babylon, but really don't have a tremendous amount of legacy that they can call their own. So what we see at this palace is Ashurnasirpal II starting to draw on traditions from around these conquered territories. We'll look at this in a little bit of depth. For one thing, he adopts stone orthostats that we saw as early as the 10th century with the Hittite Empire. And he adopts them and then adapts them for Assyrian use. These orthostats are interesting for a number of reasons. I just kind of want to point these out to you. Again, these would have protected the mud brick walls inside the palace, but also become a way of portraying decorative motifs. And we'll look at them in a bit. They're interesting in the way that they're made. Again, you would have your orthostats running along the wall and your mud brick walls on top. And you can see here the way that they're actually secured is quite interesting. Each one has 2 dowels running through it to anchor it both into the ground and also to anchor it into the mud brick wall above it. And then each orthostat itself, as you can see here, these little dovetail clamps are what connect them together. So if you're looking at this from the top down, we have two orthostats side by side. There's actually a clamp carved into each side, and what you would do is put these side by side and then fill this area with molten bronze, essentially connecting the two together. So fairly technical and just very, very sturdy way of constructing these palaces, which of course are meant to last for an eternity. The interiors of these palaces were frequently painted. Occasionally, only some of it survives. I just want to point this out to you. This is the palace right here. It's known as the Northwest Palace, and the reason for that is it's in the northwest of the citadel at Nimrud. This is sort of oriented to the side. You can see north is actually pointing to the west here, but this is the Northwest Palace of Ashurnasirpal II. And you can see its proximity here to the temples at the site. We have here a temple to Ishtar and a temple to the god Ninurta. Ninurta is a god that gains prominence during the Neo-Assyrian period. He's a god of war, and there's actually a ziggurat dedicated to him as well. And I think the proximity here between the secular and the divine is quite intentional, right? This is not like what we saw at Ugarit, with two very separate complexes very far apart. Now, during the Neo-Assyrian period, these are brought together, and we'll see the sort of symbolic role that the king plays in a little bit. But these panels, back to the orthostats at Nimrud, they're about 2 meters in height, about 6 feet tall, and they're made out of a soft, easily carved stone known as gypsum. It's kind of like alabaster, a little bit. It's also called Mosul marble. And these orthostats, again, give a tremendous amount of information on the history, ideology, and beliefs, and also daily life during the time of Ashurnasirpal. I wanted to point out the palace itself is fairly poorly preserved, but we do have its basic layout. And again, it's a palace of the courtyard variety that we've seen again and again and again, with an entrance here to an outer courtyard, this Bibanu and Bitanu courtyards, the inner and outer courtyards, separated again by a central throne room. Curiously, when this palace was being excavated, Layard actually ended up finding a stele that dedicates the palace by Ashurbanipal II. It was found in this small alcove right here, a purpose-built room for holding this stele. It's known as the banquet stele, and we'll see why it's called the banquet stele in a moment. But it was set up in this niche and visible to anyone who was actually sort of waiting in the outer courtyard for an audience with the king in this main throne room. And in this dedicatory stele, which dedicates the palace at Nimrud, we see